"You're getting me all wet," she whispered, and for a second Elias Boone thought the storm had stolen her sense along with her strength. Rain ran off the brim of his hat in a steady line, cold as creek water in late October, and the woman in his arms was shaking so hard her teeth nearly knocked together. The sky over the Montana Valley had gone the color of old iron an hour before sunset, and now the whole world seemed made of wind, mud, and slanting rain. Elias had been riding the south fence line, checking a break near the cottonwoods, when he saw her at the edge of the wash, one hand braced against a rock, the other clinging to a thin leather cord with a small silver ring tied to it, as if that little piece of metal weighed more than the storm. She had tried to cross where the bank gave way, and the runoff had taken her boots out from under her. By the time he reached her, her dress was soaked through, her dark braid plastered to her shoulder, and one ankle had already started to swell beneath the hem. She looked up when he leaned down, and even through the rain he could see the warning in her face. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The kind that had learned to stand on its own 2 feet long after hope had packed up and left. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low, the way a man talks to a skittish horse or a wounded thing in the brush. "You're hurt." She tried to pull away anyway. Pride was still in her. That told him she was not beaten all the way down. "I can walk," she said, though she could barely put weight on one foot. Then the bank slid again under her boot, and she would have gone into the muddy current if he had not caught her by the waist and lifted her clear. That was when she gave that strange, half-dazed whisper, more embarrassed than playful, more ashamed than amused. And he understood she was not teasing him at all. She was freezing, drenched, and too worn out to know where one thought ended and another began. Elias turned his body against the wind and carried her to his horse. She was lighter than she ought to have been. Up close he could smell wet wool, river mud, and smoke buried faint in her clothes, like she had come from somewhere fire had passed through and never fully left. He settled her in front of the saddle, wrapped his canvas coat around her shoulders, and took the reins with one gloved hand. She stiffened at first when his arm came around to steady her, then held herself still with the fierce effort of someone used to enduring what she could not control. The ride back to the ranch took nearly 40 minutes through rutted ground and blowing rain. Neither of them said much. Once, when thunder rolled out over the hills, she tightened her fingers around that leather cord until her knuckles turned pale beneath her skin. Elias noticed that. He noticed everything. The narrow wrist, the patched cuff, the way she kept looking behind them, not like a traveler lost in bad weather, but like someone measuring distance from a thing she prayed would not catch up before dark. By the time his cabin came into view through the weather, lamp glow faint in the window and smoke trailing from the chimney, Elias felt it plain as the rain on his face. The storm had not brought this woman to his door by accident, and whatever she was running from, it was not finished with her yet. Inside the cabin, the first thing Nia noticed was not the heat. It was the quiet, not the empty kind she had known on the road, where silence meant danger listening from just beyond sight, but a lived-in quiet, shaped by wood smoke, old boards, and the soft ticking sound of rainwater falling from the roof eaves outside. Elias pushed the door shut against the weather, set the crossbar in place, and stood there for a moment as if measuring how much of the storm had followed them in. Water darkened the floor beneath their boots. The lamplight trembled over the walls. A black stove in the corner breathed out steady warmth, and somewhere behind that warmth lingered the smell of coffee grounds, saddle leather, and clean hay carried in on a man who spent more time with horses than with people. He moved without hurry, though nothing in him was careless. He took a wool blanket from a peg, set it near the stove, then pulled out a straight-back chair for her as if he had done it 1,000 times for someone who was no longer there. Nia saw that much in one glance. Some absences never needed naming. She lowered herself into the chair with care, trying not to let the pain in her ankle show more than it had to. Elias knelt once to look at the swelling, then rose again before his nearness could make her flinch. That small restraint did not escape her. Most men noticed discomfort only when it inconvenienced them. This one noticed it and stepped back. He poured water from a kettle into a basin, tested it with the back of one finger, then set a clean cloth beside it. "You can use that," he said. "There are dry things by the stove. Not yours, but warm." His voice was plain, with no effort to sound gentle, which somehow made the kindness in it feel more real. Naya looked toward the folded clothes he meant. A washed-work shirt, thick wool socks, a worn blanket-lined coat too big for her by half. She kept the silver ring closed in her fist and asked the question that mattered most. How far is the road from here? Elias was feeding wood into the stove when she spoke. He did not turn right away. Almost 3 miles in this weather. And town? 9, maybe 10. She let out a breath that almost trembled and hid it by bending over the basin. Mud loosened from her hands in brown threads. The water cooled quickly. She cleaned her face, her wrists, the back of her neck, then stopped before she had to ask for more. Asking had a way of lowering a person in the eyes of others. She had learned that lesson too early and too well. Elias crossed to the shelf, brought another kettle down, and filled the basin again without a word. On the table nearby sat a plate with 2 biscuits left from supper, a jar of molasses, and a tin cup turned upside down on a folded cloth. Nothing in the room was fancy. Everything had been used and mended and used again. The cabin was not poor in the way town people talked about poverty, with contempt folded into every sentence. It was careful, measured, built by hands that knew exactly how much a thing cost to replace. Naya changed behind a hanging quilt near the back wall, moving slowly because her ankle would not let her do otherwise. The dry shirt smelled faintly of cedar and sunshine stored from another season. The socks were thick and scratchy, and when she pulled them on, warmth stung her feet so suddenly it made her shut her eyes. She stood still there for a moment, one hand on the quilt, breathing through the strange ache that comes when the body begins to trust the cold is over. When she stepped out again, Elias had set a bowl on the table. Beans, salt pork, and the last of a cornbread heel broken in half. Steam rose from it in thin white ribbons. He had also moved his own chair farther back, leaving the table open in a way that said he understood distance better than most. Naya sat. For a few seconds, she only watched the steam. Hot food had become one of those things she no longer expected until it was in front of her. "Thank you," she said at last. Elias gave a small nod as if thanks were not something he knew what to do with. He poured coffee into his own cup and leaned one shoulder against the wall rather than sitting across from her. The rain tapped at the window. Wind brushed the chimney. Outside, the horses shifted in the shelter of the lean-to. "You from around here?" he asked. It was not suspicion in his voice. Not exactly. It was a practical question, asked by a man trying to decide whether he was dealing with trouble that belonged nearby or trouble that had traveled a long way to arrive at his door. Naya broke off a piece of cornbread before answering. "No. You headed somewhere?" She met his eyes then, and in them she saw no greed, no easy judgment, no impatient hunger for another person's story. But she also saw the steadiness of a man who would hear the truth if it came and would know a lie when it did. "Away," she said. One side of his mouth moved almost into a smile, though not enough to become one. "That tells me less than you think." She looked down at the bowl. The silver ring knocked softly against the spoon when her hand shifted. Elias noticed the sound. His gaze dropped to the leather cord looped around her fingers, then rose again without comment. Yet something in the room changed all the same. Not danger. Recognition, maybe. As if he had placed that small object in his mind beside some old memory and had not decided what it meant. Naya took a bite, then another. Hunger outrang caution. The warmth spread through her chest slowly, loosening a knot she had been carrying since dawn, maybe longer. Elias watched the storm through the window for a while before speaking again. "You can stay the night. Weather will not break before morning." Naya looked up sharply. Men often offered shelter. They usually made it sound like a bargain. He said it like a fact, the way a man might mention snow in the pass or a lame horse in the barn. "And in the morning?" she asked. Elias turned the cup once between his hands. Firelight moved across the weathered lines of his face. "In the morning, we will see what the daylight says." It was not a promise, but it was not a threat either. For the first time in more days than she could count, Naya felt something inside her unclench by a fraction. Not trust. Not yet. Something smaller. A pause in the running. And sometimes, for a soul worn thin, that was the nearest thing to mercy. By morning the storm had worn itself out against the hills and left the valley scrubbed pale and shining under a hard Montana sky. Frost silvered the yard beyond the window. The rain had turned to a thin crust along the fence rails, and the cottonwoods by the creek stood bare and still, their branches drawn black against the cold light. Naya woke on a narrow bed made up near the stove with two folded quilts under her and one over her shoulders. For a moment she did not move. She listened. No raised voices. No footsteps outside the door. No harness creaking in the yard that did not belong there. Only the low pop of settling embers and the distant sound of a horse pawing at frozen ground. The quiet felt different in daylight. Smaller, maybe. Less like a shelter borrowed from the dark, and more like a place that had learned to hold itself together through many winters. Elias was already up. She could hear him before she saw him, moving outside with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had chores whether the world had ended or not. A bucket handle struck wood. A gate latch clicked. Somewhere a horse snorted steam into the morning. Naya sat up slowly and tested her ankle. The swelling had not gone down much, but the heat and dry socks had kept it from turning worse. That alone felt like a blessing she had not earned. She rose, folded the blanket as neatly as she could, and crossed to the small washstand. In daylight the cabin showed its true age. The table had knife marks worn smooth by years. One window had been repaired with narrower boards that did not quite match the rest. A row of tin plates hung above the shelf. Near the door stood a pair of snow chains, a coil of rope, and a shovel with a handle polished by long use. There were no decorations besides a faded photograph tucked into the frame of the mirror and a pressed sprig of something dry and brittle set beside it. She did not stare long enough to be rude, but she saw enough to know the photograph had once mattered to him. Outside, the cold bit through the borrowed shirt the second she opened the door. Elias was at the woodpile, splitting kindling with short, efficient strokes, not wasteful, not showy. His coat hung open despite the chill. The horses stood near the corral with their backs to the wind, patient and rough-haired, the color of old pennies and smoke. Beyond them, the valley rolled out wide and empty under 4 or 5 inches of fresh crust, the mountains to the west holding a line of early sun on their shoulders. Elias looked up when he heard the door. He lowered the axe at once. Not because he feared her, because some manners come from decency and some from sorrow, and often they look the same. "How is the ankle?" he asked. "Still there," she said, and that almost made him smile again. Almost. He stepped closer, but not so close that she would have to retreat. "Can you stand on it?" She tried. The pain went clean and sharp up the side of her leg. She caught the doorframe before it showed fully on her face. Elias noticed anyway. "That means no," he said. "Inside. I will bring breakfast." Naya should have objected. She should have said she could help, could work, could earn what she had been given. Instead, she only nodded and went back in, embarrassed by how quickly her body obeyed the promise of warmth. He came in a few minutes later carrying a cast-iron pan in one hand and 2 plates balanced in the other. He set eggs, fried potatoes, and the last strip of yesterday's bacon on the table with the same practical care he seemed to give everything. Then he poured hot coffee for himself and hot water for her with a spoonful of molasses stirred in. "Sweet helps when the cold gets into your bones," he said. Naya wrapped both hands around the cup. The steam rose against her face. "You always feed strangers like this?" Elias took his seat at the far end of the table, leaving room enough for air between them. "No." "Then why me?" He looked at the pan for a second before answering. "Because you needed it." That should have sounded simple. It did not. It sounded costly. As if he had reached for a truth he did not often hand to other people. Naya ate in silence for a while, listening to the wind drag lightly over the roof. When she raised her eyes, she found his attention on the leather cord at her wrist. She had looped it there during the night without thinking, the silver ring resting against the pulse point under her thumb. "You carry that like it matters," he said. Naya closed her hand over it. "It does. Family." She hesitated. A man could ask a question like that for many reasons. Curiosity, greed, calculation. Elias sounded like none of those things. Still, caution had kept her alive longer than trust ever had. "My mother's," she said at last. "It was all I kept." Elias gave one slow nod, as if that answered more than she had meant to say. Then, after a pause, he rose, crossed to the shelf, and brought down a small tin box. He set it gently on the table between them. Inside lay thread, clean cloth, a bottle of liniment, and strips of bandage folded so carefully they might have been church linen. "Let me see the ankle," he said. Naya did not move at first. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Her fingers tightened around the ring. Elias waited. He did not reach. For her. He did not tell her she was being foolish. He only stood there with the box open and patience in his face, as if time meant less to him than whether she would choose freely. At last Naya pushed her chair back and stretched her leg out. He knelt on one knee, hands steady, eyes on the swelling and not on her. The touch, when it came, was gentle and brief. He worked like a man mending tack, attentive to strain, careful where the leather had already weakened. "You were lucky," he said. "Another step wrong, and you would have broken it. Luck and I are not close friends." This time he did smile, faint and tired. Then his expression changed. Not much, just enough for her to feel it. His fingers had brushed the edge of the leather cord where it hung down from her wrist. He looked at the silver ring for one beat too long. "Where did your mother get this?" he asked. Naya's breath caught. "Why?" Elias lifted his eyes to hers. In the cold morning light, they looked grayer than before, almost the color of weathered fence wood. "Because I have seen that mark." He touched nothing now, only watched her face. Not the ring itself, the engraving on it. Years ago, outside, one of the horses stamped. The sound carried through the walls like a warning from another life. Naya pulled her hand back on instinct, and the small ring flashed once in the light between them. Elias did not try to stop her, but the silence that followed was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing breakfast. It had changed shape. Something had opened. Something that, once named, would not go back to sleep. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The stove gave a soft iron sigh as the wood settled, and somewhere outside a loose shutter tapped once in the wind, then went still again. Naya kept her hand closed around the ring, as if the old silver had suddenly grown warm enough to burn. Elias eased back onto his heels and shut the tin box without looking away from her face. He did not seem alarmed. That was what unsettled her most. Alarm she knew how to answer. Curiosity too. But this was something quieter, something that made room instead of taking it. "Where did you see it?" she asked. Elias rose slowly, favoring his left knee the way men do when years of saddle time begin to collect their payment. He crossed to the shelf, reached behind a stack of folded towels, and brought down a small ledger bound in cracked brown leather. It was not a bank book or a merchant record. It looked personal, the kind of thing a man keeps only because some facts are too stubborn to trust to memory. He set it on the table and opened it with care, turning 2 or 3 pages before laying one flat beneath his palm. 5 winters ago, he said, a drifter came through looking for work. He had a busted wagon wheel and a fever, so I let him stay 2 nights in the barn loft until he could ride again. Before he left, he paid me with a silver buckle and a story I did not ask for. Naya said nothing. Elias traced one blunt finger under a line of writing, then turned the ledger so she could see. There, in the margin beside a date and a place name she did not recognize, he had drawn a small mark. Not the ring itself, but the engraving carved into it. A curved line, a mountain shape, and 3 small stars. Her breath caught before she could stop it. Elias heard that too. He heard everything. He said he had seen the mark on a trunk that belonged to an Apache woman and her mother, Elias said. Said they had been taken east with other families driven off their land after a water claim changed hands. He paused, and the room seemed to narrow around those words. He also said a man named Gideon Price had begun buying debts in that part of the territory around the same time. At the sound of that name, Naya's face lost what little color the cold had left her. She looked toward the window, not because there was anything there, but because people often turn toward light when old darkness comes back. Elias did not miss the change. So I was right, he said softly. It was not triumph. It was sorrow wearing a practical coat. Naya stood too quickly, pain flashing through her ankle, and caught the back of the chair. You were not right about anything, she said, but the words had no strength behind them. You know one mark. One story from a sick stranger. That is not knowing. Elias closed the ledger. No, it is not. He let that sit between them. Then he added, but it is enough to tell me you have reason to run. Naya turned away and went to the window, the ring still locked in her hand. Outside, the valley looked clean and distant, as if no human trouble had ever crossed it. The creek threw back a pale stripe of light. A hawk rode the air above the far pasture. It would have been a beautiful morning if beauty had ever been enough to keep a person safe. My mother told me never to let this leave my hand, she said at last. Her voice had gone low and careful, the way a person walks over thin ice. She said if anyone saw it and knew what it was, I must decide very fast whether they were the kind who would help me or the kind who would sell me. Elias leaned one shoulder against the wall near the stove. He did not come closer. And which kind am I? The question was plain. No wounded pride in it. No demand. Naya looked down at the yard where his boot tracks crossed the fresh frost in straight, practical lines from house to corral to woodpile and back again. A lonely man's map. A truthful one. I do not know yet, she said. Elias nodded as if that were the most reasonable answer in the world. Fair enough. He poured more hot water into her cup, then his own, giving both of them something to do with their hands besides reach for what should not be rushed. You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to tell me, he said. But if Gideon Price is tied to this, then you should know he has business in redemption. Papers, loans, half the feed contracts west of the river. Men like him do not need to raise their voices. They wait until a family is short one season, then they own next season too. Naya closed her eyes for one brief second. When she opened them again, the old watchfulness had returned sharper than before. He is coming through here? He comes through every few weeks, Elias said. Sometimes less, sometimes more. Depends on who owes him. The silence after that was heavy enough to hear. Naya set the cup down carefully so the tin would not rattle against the table. Then I cannot stay. Elias did not answer right away. Instead, he crossed to the door, looked out at the bright, hard day, then back at her swollen ankle. You cannot travel 10 miles in that condition, he said. Not by noon. Maybe not by tomorrow. Then I will try anyway. And if you fall in the wash again? The words were still gentle, but they landed where excuses could not. Naya lifted her chin. Better the road than being found here. Elias studied her for a long second, and in that second she saw the shape of his loneliness more clearly than before. It was not emptiness. It was discipline. A life pared down until only what could be carried alone remained. I am going into town this afternoon, he said. For lamp oil, feed, and a new hinge for the south gate. Stay here until I come back. Rest the ankle. Keep the door barred if anyone rides up. If it is me, I will knock twice, wait, then knock once. Naya frowned. Why would you do that for me? Elias reached for his hat on the peg by the door. Because sometimes trouble reaches a place before the truth does. He set the hat on his head and opened the door to the cold. Light spilled across the floorboards. And because I would rather know what is coming than leave you to guess alone. The door closed behind Elias, and with it went the one steady sound in the house she had not known she was listening for. Naya stood very still in the middle of the cabin until the last echo of hoofbeats faded down the frozen track toward redemption. Only then did she move. She barred the door the way he had shown her, checked the latch on the back window, and crossed to the stove to feed in another piece of wood. The room held his absence in a strange way. Not empty, just paused, as if the cabin itself had grown used to one man's silence and did not yet know what to make of a second breathing soul. She tried to sit, tried to rest, but rest had never come easily to people who had learned to measure safety by the minute. So she worked with what she had. She washed the breakfast plates. She folded the blanket tighter. She swept a thin trail of dried mud from the boards near the door where last night's storm had left its mark. The chores were small, but they steadied her. In every place she had passed through, labor was the one language that asked nothing soft from her. By noon the sun had climbed high enough to throw a cold white bar across the floorboards. Naya stood by the window and looked out over the pasture. The ranch spread wide and spare under the clear sky, every fence line honest, every gate repaired more from discipline than pride. She could read a great deal about a man by the way he kept land. Elias Boone did not leave much to chance. Yet the place did not feel hard. It felt lonely. The barn roof had been patched twice with different timber. A small flower bed near the porch had gone dry long ago, but its border stones were still set in a neat half circle, as if someone once cared whether something delicate might bloom there. She looked away from that quickly. Some griefs were private, even when no one named them. An hour later, she heard riders on the road. Her whole body went still before her mind caught up. Not one horse. Two. Moving at an easy pace, the kind men use when they have no fear of being refused at the end of a drive. Naya stepped away from the window and into the angle beside the stove, where she could see the door without being seen from outside. The knock came once, then again, too brisk to be Elias, too certain to be a stranger asking for directions. She did not answer. After a few seconds, a voice called through the wood. "Boone, you in there?" Another voice followed, smoother, carrying the lazy confidence of a man who had spent enough years being obeyed that he no longer bothered to sound forceful. "I was told he rode into town. Shame to miss him. Fine spread for a man alone." Naya knew that second kind of voice. It belonged to men who made ownership sound like courtesy. She held her breath and did not move. Boots creaked on the porch. The first man tried the latch. When it held, he gave a small laugh. "Locked up in daylight. That is unlike Boone." The smooth voice came closer to the door. Maybe he finally found something worth guarding. Naya's hand tightened around the silver ring until the edge pressed into her palm. The men remained there only a minute more, but each second seemed to pull across the wood like a blade over leather. Then the porch boards sighed under their weight as they turned away. Hoofbeats receded. She stayed where she was until the yard lay still again. When she finally stepped to the window, the riders were small in the distance, two dark marks moving east, but one of them sat a horse too elegantly for a ranch hand and wore a coat cut finer than a man needed for weather. Even at that distance, she felt the old dread move through her like cold creek water. Gideon Price did not need to be seen clearly for fear to know his shape. Elias returned just before sundown with a sack of feed, a wrapped tin of lamp oil, and a face that told her before he spoke that the day had given him little comfort. He tied his horse, brought in the supplies, and set them down by the table. Then he looked at her once and knew. Someone came. Naya nodded. Two men. Elias took off his gloves finger by finger, slow and controlled. "Let me guess. One talked too much, and the other sounded polite enough to rot the boards." "Yes." A muscle moved once along his jaw. That would be Clyde Mercer and Gideon Price. He crossed to the stove, added wood, and watched the flame catch before saying more. "Price was in Henderson's store when I got there. He asked whether I had seen a young woman traveling alone. Said her family wanted her returned before she got herself into trouble." Naya let out one soft, bitter breath. He always talks like he is rescuing what he is really reaching for. Elias turned then. "So it is him." She met his eyes, and this time did not look away. There was no point left in half-truths. "My mother died owing money she never truly owed. Gideon bought the paper after my father was gone. He said a widow needed protection. Then he said debt could be settled with arrangements, work, promises, marriage if he was feeling generous. I ran before he could decide which lie to use." The room went quiet around that. Elias did not offer pity. He did not lower his eyes or rush to fill the silence. He simply stood there taking the truth as if it deserved its full weight. "And the ring?" he asked. Naya held it up between finger and thumb. The silver caught the firelight and flashed once, small and stubborn. "My mother said this belonged to her mother before her. She said it marked our family long before white men drew lines across maps and called them law. There is a church record in Red Elk Valley with my mother's name and mine. If I can reach it, Price cannot claim I owe what he says I owe. He cannot say I am no one." Elias looked at the ring, then at her face. "Red Elk Valley is west of here by maybe 30 miles. Hard country this time of year. I know. And your ankle will not carry you halfway. I know that too." Firelight moved between them. Outside, the last of the day drained out of the sky, leaving the windows dark as old tin. Elias set one hand flat on the table, the other at his side, and Naya had the strange feeling that she was watching a man step across an invisible line inside himself. "Then you will not go alone," he said. Naya stared at him. "You would come with me?" He gave the smallest shrug, as if the answer were less generous than practical. "You need a horse, a guide, and someone Price does not expect to stand in his way." Then, after a beat, his voice dropped lower. "And I do not much care for men who call taking a woman home the same thing as helping her." They left before first light, when the world was still more shadow than shape and the frost on the yard boards shone faint under a thinning moon. Elias saddled his bay gelding in silence, moving by lantern glow and habit, while Naya stood near the porch rail wrapped in his old coat, testing her ankle one careful shift at a time. The swelling had eased enough for the stirrup, though not without pain. Elias had noticed that too. He noticed everything. He did not say. She looked tired, or frightened, or unready. He only tightened the last cinch, tied a bedroll behind his saddle, and handed her a cup of coffee gone warm enough to drink without burning. "It is 28 miles if we cut through the cedar ridge and keep off the main road," he said. "Longer if the creek is running high." Naya held the cup between both hands and watched her breath drift white in the dark. "And if Price sends men after us?" Elias checked the strap on the pack mule, then looked up. "Then I hope they prefer comfort to effort." It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him, and because it came so dry, so quiet, it reached her more deeply than a brighter man might have meant it to. They rode out with the lamp in the cabin window burning low behind them, the ranch shrinking into the pale distance as dawn slowly found the valley. The land opened around them in long winter-brown folds, fence lines silvered with frost, bunch grass brittle beneath the horses' hooves, the mountains to the west carrying a first wash of pink that lasted less than a minute before turning cold and white. Elias kept them off the wagon road, following a line through the low draws and cedar breaks where hoofprints would be harder to read. He rode a little ahead when the trail narrowed, then beside her when the ground turned rough, never reaching for the reins of her horse, never treating her like something fragile that needed managing. That, more than any promise, made the miles easier. By mid-morning the sun had climbed high enough to soften the frost along the creek banks. They stopped in the shelter of a stand of juniper where the wind could not cut straight through them. Elias watered the horses from a canvas bucket, then crouched by Naya's stirrup and checked the wrap on her ankle without asking twice. His fingers were firm and careful, and when pain crossed her face, he eased off at once. "You can keep riding?" he asked. "Yes." He studied her for one beat longer than necessary, as if measuring whether pride was answering instead of truth. Then he nodded. From his saddlebag he pulled out a biscuit wrapped in cloth, a slice of dried apple, and half a piece of cheese. He handed her the bigger half without comment. They ate under a bright hard sky while crows moved in the distance above a harvested field. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel sharp anymore. It felt like something they were both learning to shape together. At last Naya turned the ring in her fingers and asked, "Why do you live alone?" Elias sat back against a rock, hat tipped low, eyes on the valley below. "Because it is quieter that way." "That is not an answer. It is the one I have." She waited. Wind moved lightly through the juniper branches, carrying the smell of resin and cold dirt. Then Elias spoke again, as if the land itself had asked the question and he could not quite refuse it. "My wife liked a house full of sound," he said. "She sang while she cooked. My little boy used to drag a wooden horse across the floor until I thought I would lose my mind from hearing it. Then one winter a fever came through the valley. By spring the house was quiet enough to hear the nails settling in the walls." He said it without dramatics, without asking for sympathy, which made the sorrow in it hit harder than any broken voice could have done. Naya lowered her eyes to the ring in her palm. "I am sorry." Elias gave a small shrug that did not dismiss the grief so much as admit it had been living with him too long to be moved by apologies. "That was years ago. Years do not always carry things away." He looked at her then, fully, and there was something in that look that changed the air between them. Recognition. Not the easy kind that comes from shared taste or shared hometown roads. The deeper kind. The kind that comes when two people have both been left standing after life has taken what it pleased and called the balance fair. They rode on after that through a narrow cut where sandstone rose in weathered red shoulders on either side of the trail. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere far off, cattle lowed from winter pasture. Near noon Elias reined in at the top of a rise and scanned the ground below. "Tracks," he said. Naya felt her stomach tighten. "Fresh." Elias tipped his head, studying the prints where the trail widened into. Soft earth near a spring seep. Maybe 3 horses. Maybe 4. A few hours ahead, or behind if they turned. He was quiet for a second, then added, "Could be ranch hands. Could be nobody that matters. But we do not stay in the open." They angled west into rougher country, where cedar gave way to broken stone, and the trail narrowed to little more than a game path. Progress slowed. The horses picked their footing carefully. More than once Elias dismounted and led them across loose rock so Naya would not have to force her ankle against the stirrups too hard. Each time he did, he acted like it was the trail he was helping, not her, and she understood the gift in that. By late afternoon the sky had begun to gray over again, not with a storm yet, but with the kind of winter cloud that could turn a long ride into a dangerous one if a man ignored it. Elias pointed toward a low bluff where an abandoned line shack leaned into the hillside, half hidden by scrub oak. We stop there, he said. Another 10 miles to Red Elk Valley from here. Better to go in with light than arrive cold and blind. The shack was barely more than 4 walls, a roof, and an old stove missing one leg, but it broke the wind. Elias unsaddled the horses, rubbed them down, and set feed in a canvas nosebag one at a time. Naya gathered dry brush from under the eaves and brought it inside. Working side by side in the fading light, they needed almost no words. The fire caught on the third match. Warmth spread slowly through the shack, thin at first, then steady. Elias hung his coffee pot over the flame and set a folded blanket on the cleaner side of the floorboards for her. Naya watched him move through the dim orange light and thought how strange it was that a man so used to solitude had made room for her, without once behaving as if the room belonged to him more. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed for the briefest second. Neither of them pulled away too sharply. That mattered. Outside, the wind pressed softly at the walls. Inside, the fire painted shifting shadows across the boards. Naya cradled the cup and said, almost to herself, all this way for a church record and an old ring. It sounds small when spoken out loud. Elias sat across from her, one arm resting on a bent knee, his hat beside him on the floor. Small things decide large things all the time. Naya looked up. Do you believe that? I believe a missing paper can steal a ranch. I believe one bad winter can empty a house. And I believe one decent choice, made at the right time, can keep a person from disappearing. The words settled into her more deeply than the coffee. For a moment the room was very still. Then, from somewhere beyond the shack, came the faint, unmistakable sound of another horse moving over stone. Elias did not lunge for anything. He only turned his head once toward the door, every line of him suddenly alert. Stay by the fire, he said softly, and do not answer unless I do. The sound came again, clearer this time, a careful hoof scraping stone just beyond the lean side of the shack. Naya set the tin cup down without a word. The fire gave off a low, steady heat, but the room no longer felt warm in the same way. Elias rose in one smooth motion, not hurried, not loud, and crossed to the door with the kind of quiet a man learns only after years of listening to weather, stock, and trouble with equal care. He did not reach for a weapon. He only placed one hand near the latch and waited, head tilted slightly, measuring what stood outside by the weight of its silence. Then a voice came through the boards, old and worn and calm as dry cedar. No cause for fear, Boone. If I meant harm, I would not be announcing myself to your door. Elias glanced back once at Naya. She had gone still by the fire, her face turned toward the voice as though it had stepped out of a far memory. Elias lifted the latch and opened the door a careful foot. Cold evening light entered first, blue and thin. Then the figure beyond it took shape. He was an Apache elder, maybe 60, maybe older, wrapped in a dark blanket coat with frost along the hem, his gray-streaked braid resting over one shoulder. His horse stood a few yards back, head low, patient under the fading sky. The old man did not step forward until Elias moved aside. Even then he entered with the measured dignity of someone who knew exactly how much space he was owed and had no interest in taking more. His eyes found Naya at once. For one suspended second no one spoke. Then the elder looked at the silver ring in her hand and said one word in Apache, soft enough that Elias could not follow it, though he understood from the way Naya closed her eyes that the word had reached somewhere deep. She answered in the same language, not quickly, not like a frightened person, but like someone opening a door that had stayed locked too long. The elder came closer to the fire and stopped, still giving her room. His face did not break into surprise or relief. It settled into something heavier and steadier than either. Recognition with grief behind it. Naya's voice, when she returned to English, was low. This is Thomas Greyhawk. He knew my mother. Elias nodded once. Then he is welcome. Greyhawk studied him for a moment, taking in the worn coat, the travel dust, the fact that Naya sat unbound and unafraid near his fire. Whatever judgment he made seemed to satisfy him. He lowered himself onto the stool by the wall with care born of age and cold miles. Elias poured him coffee without being asked. The old man accepted it with both hands, breathed in the steam once, and then looked at Naya again. "We searched for you after Red Elk," he said. "There were many lies on the road. Some said you were dead. Some said you had gone east. Your mother feared men like Price more than winter itself." At the mention of that name, the fire seemed to shrink. Naya kept her eyes on the ring. She feared correctly. Greyhawk nodded. Yes. The simple word held more sorrow than a longer speech could have carried. For a little while the shack was filled only with the murmur of the stove and the thin wind outside. Elias sat back near the door, listening without pressing, his face unreadable except for the alert stillness that had become familiar to her. Naya drew a slow breath. "I told him about the church record," she said, tilting her head slightly toward Elias. "And the debt papers." Greyhawk gave Elias another measuring glance. "Then he knows more than most white men in this territory would care to know." "He knows enough," Naya said. Something in her voice changed when she said it. Not softness exactly. Trust beginning to put down one careful root. Greyhawk heard that too. The elder set the coffee cup on his knee and looked into the fire as if it might hold the shape of the past in its coals. "Your mother came to the mission once each planting season," he said. "She had the priest record names because she knew papers would one day matter to people who respected paper more than blood, memory, or land. She said that if trouble ever came, the written line might stand where a woman's word would not." He let that settle, then added, "The record still exists. I saw it this autumn with my own eyes." Naya looked up sharply, hope striking across her face so suddenly it almost hurt to witness. "You are sure?" "I am sure." For the first time since Elias had found her by the wash, the fear in her expression gave way to something else. Not relief. Relief would have been too easy. This was fiercer than that. The look of a person seeing, at last, that the door ahead might truly open if she could just reach it. Elias leaned forward a little. "Then tomorrow we ride into Red Elk Valley, get the record, and bring it before the sheriff in redemption." Greyhawk turned his cup once between his hands. "The sheriff may see it," he said. "But men tied to debt do not always untie themselves because the truth arrives." Elias gave a dry breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That has been my experience too." The old man inclined his head, as if that answer had told him something important. Then he looked back to Naya. "Price is not in Red Elk tonight. He rode south this afternoon with 2 men, asking after a rancher and an Apache woman. He thinks he is ahead of you." Elias's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in calculation. "Then for once, let him be wrong." Greyhawk drew from inside his coat a folded piece of cloth bound with twine. He handed it to Naya. Her fingers trembled when she opened it. Inside lay a small scrap of paper, worn at the edges, with a name written in faded ink and the mark of the mission beside it. Not the full record. Only enough to prove that the larger record existed and that someone had gone to pains to preserve the trail. Naya stared at it, as if the paper itself had weight. "My mother kept this. She gave it to me," Greyhawk said, "in case she could not keep it safe herself." The fire snapped softly. Outside, darkness had nearly closed around the shack, and the horses shifted closer to the lee wall. Elias watched Naya's face as she held the paper and the ring together, silver and ink, memory and proof. 2 small things. Enough, perhaps, to challenge a man who had spent years turning other people's hardship into property. Greyhawk rose after a while, slower than he had sat, and pulled his blanket coat around him. "I will ride ahead at first light and wait near the mission road," he said. 3 riders together draw more notice than 2, and some truths arrive better when they are not seen coming. Elias stood as well. "You trust me with her?" The question was plain, and Naya looked between them without breathing. Greyhawk answered without hesitation. "No man is proved by words. But she is still here. She still wears her own name in her eyes. That is enough for tonight." Then he turned to Naya and placed one weathered hand lightly over his heart. "Your mother was not broken by fear," he said. "Do not honor her by being smaller than she was." When he stepped back into the cold and disappeared into the gathering dark, the shack seemed both emptier and somehow steadier than before. Naya remained by the fire with the paper in one hand and the ring in the other. Elias did not speak for a long moment. At last he said, very quietly, "You are closer now than you were yesterday." Naya looked up at him. Firelight moved across his face, along the weathered lines and the calm watchfulness that never seemed to leave him. "So are you," she said, and neither of them pretended not to understand what she meant. They reached Red Elk Valley under a pale, gray morning sky that held the kind of light winter gives when it wants the land to look honest before men begin lying on it again. The mission sat low against the rise above the creek, its whitewashed walls weathered by years of wind and smoke, its bell tower simple and unadorned, as if faith out here had long ago learned to do without grandeur. Elias reined in near the cottonwoods and looked over the place with the quiet caution he gave everything unfamiliar. A few wagons stood by the side fence. 2 horses were tied near the well. No crowd. No sign of Gideon Price. That should have eased Naya. It did not. Sometimes the absence of trouble meant only that trouble had arrived earlier and was waiting indoors. Greyhawk met them where the mission road narrowed, just as he had promised. He said little, only nodded once to Elias and once to Naya, then turned his horse and led them up the last rise. The priest who received them was a narrow man with white hair, red hands, and the careful gaze of someone who had spent years witnessing grief without growing blind to it. He knew Greyhawk. He knew the family name. Naya spoke in a low voice that almost failed her at the end. And when he heard Gideon Price's name, something in his face darkened, not with surprise, but with old recognition. Come inside, he said. If there are papers to be found, they will not improve by freezing on the shelf. The mission office smelled of lamp oil, old cedar, and ink long dried into brittle pages. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Records sat stacked in ledgers and tied bundles, marriages beside baptisms, burials beside land notes. Every human life reduced to lines and names, because that was how the world insisted on remembering what it had first refused to respect. Elias removed his hat and stood near the door, saying nothing, yet somehow making the small room feel steadier. Naya remained by the desk with the ring in one hand and the scrap of paper in the other. The priest untied a faded ribbon around a ledger, so old its spine had been repaired twice. He turned pages slowly, his finger following the columns. Greyhawk watched in silence. Outside, a horse stamped once near the well. Then the priest stopped. For a moment he said nothing. He simply adjusted his spectacles, lowered his eyes again, and read the line once more as if to spare them the risk of hope arriving too quickly. Then he looked up at Naya. Here, he said softly, your mother, and below her, the record of you, entered the same spring. Family line, place of origin, and witness mark. Naya did not speak. Elias saw her throat move, saw the way her fingers tightened around the silver ring, saw how close a person can come to shaking apart while still standing absolutely still. The priest turned the book so she could read for herself. There it was in faded brown ink, older than the lies that had followed her, older than the debt paper Gideon had used like a rope around other people's necks. Her mother's name, her own, a line of truth set down before greed had a chance to rewrite it. For one long second the room held nothing but the sound of pages and breath. Then the outer door opened. No slam, no raised voice. Just the measured sound of expensive boots crossing old floorboards, as if the place already belonged to the man walking through it. Gideon Price appeared in the doorway with Clyde Mercer just behind him and the sheriff from Redemption close enough to suggest duty, far enough to avoid looking owned. Gideon removed his gloves finger by finger, smiling the way men do when they intend to make cruelty sound reasonable. Well, he said, glancing from Naya to Elias to the open ledger on the desk. It seems I was right to come after all. The priest straightened. Greyhawk did not move. Elias only shifted half a step nearer to Naya, not touching her, not claiming her, just making his presence plain. Gideon's smile thinned when he saw that. Miss Naya, he said, as though speaking to a wayward niece and not a grown woman who had crossed hard country to escape him. You have caused considerable concern. Your mother's obligations did not vanish simply because you ran from them. Naya lifted her chin. The old fear was still there, Elias could see it, but it no longer ruled the room. My mother owed no obligation to you beyond what you invented on paper. Gideon let out a small patient sigh. Paper is how the world keeps order. Greyhawk's gaze sharpened, but he remained silent. Elias spoke before anyone else could. Paper is also how men hide theft when they are too polished to call it by its name. Gideon turned his eyes toward him then, and the polite mask slipped just enough to show the harder thing beneath. This does not concern you, Boone. Elias did not raise his voice. He never had to. It concerns me the minute a man mistakes a woman for property and calls it order. The sheriff shifted his weight. Clyde Mercer looked from one face to another, suddenly less certain of the air in the room. The priest placed one hand flat on the open ledger, as if to steady not the book, but the truth inside it. The record is valid, he said. Entered before witnesses. Sealed by the mission. Her family line and name are established here. Gideon's eyes cooled. A church note does not clear debt. No, Nia said, and this time her voice did not waver at all. She stepped closer to the desk and laid the silver ring beside the ledger. But it proves what you knew all along. That my mother was not alone, not nameless, and not yours to arrange. The ring caught the thin window light. Greyhawk reached into his coat and set down the old scrap of paper she had carried through the night before. The priest opened a drawer, removed another folded note, and placed it beside the rest. Piece by piece the table changed. Not into a battlefield. Into something stronger. A plain wooden desk carrying proof, memory, and witness. The sheriff leaned in at last, reading more carefully now. His face shifted from discomfort to unease, from unease to the expression men wear when the easy story they agreed to believe begins collapsing under the weight of facts. Gideon saw it happen and stepped forward. Elias moved once, only once, between him and the desk. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He simply stood there, hat in hand, weather in his coat, and said, "You can argue with me if that helps your pride. But you will not put your hand over her name while I am standing here." No one spoke after that. Outside, wind moved softly past the mission walls. Inside, the silence thickened until it no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to judgment. The sheriff cleared his throat first. If the mission record stands, and the witness papers stand with it, then no private claim can force her return against her will. He said it reluctantly, as though decency had reached him by a road he had hoped to avoid. Gideon's jaw tightened. For the first time since entering, he looked less like a man in command and more like a man discovering that all his polished edges had met something rougher and far less movable than he had expected. Nia kept her eyes on him. "I am not your debt," she said. "I am not your settlement. And I am not disappearing for your convenience." The words landed harder because she did not shout them. Gideon looked from her to Elias, then to Greyhawk, then to the priest and the sheriff and the open ledger that had just turned his preferred lie into a smaller thing. He said nothing. He could not. There are moments when a room strips a man more cleanly than any public accusation ever could. This was one of them. And Elias, standing there in his worn coat with winter dust still on his boots, understood something then that the valley itself had been trying to tell him for days. Some showdowns are won without noise. Some rescues happen not on horseback in the dark, but in broad daylight with witnesses, paper, and one person finally refusing to bow. By the time they rode back into Redemption 2 days later, the valley had already begun doing what valleys always do when truth arrives late. It had started talking. Not loudly, not bravely. In the feed store doorway. Along the boardwalk outside the mercantile. Near the hitching rail by the saloon where men leaned as if they were discussing whether when they were really deciding whether shame ought to reach them too. Elias Boone did not look left or right as he rode beside Nia down the main street. He kept his hat low against the winter sun, his shoulders easy, his pace unhurried. Nia sat straight in the saddle, the silver ring at her wrist, the folded copy of the mission record tucked safely inside her coat. Greyhawk rode with them as far as the church and then turned away without ceremony, leaving them to finish the last part alone. Some people lowered their eyes when they saw him. Others watched him go and tried to look as though they had always meant to stand on the correct side of things. The sheriff met them on the steps of the office with the same hat in his hands he should have removed much earlier in the week. He was a decent enough man by frontier standards, which was another way of saying he had waited too long to become one. He cleared his throat, nodded to Elias, then to Nia, and stepped aside without offering a speech. That, Elias thought, was probably for the best. Inside, the office smelled of dust, old paper, and wood smoke carried in on coats that had seen too many winters. The sheriff opened the ledger copy from the mission, checked the seal again though he had already done that twice before, and wrote out a statement in his careful, uneven hand affirming that no private debt claim could compel Nia's return, labor, or marriage. He sanded the ink, blew lightly across the page, and handed it to her with a look that did not quite rise to apology, but had left pride behind. Naya accepted it with both hands. There was no triumph in her face, only something quieter and stronger. The look of a person receiving back a piece of herself that should never have been taken into dispute. When they stepped outside, Gideon Price was waiting across the street near the mercantile porch, dressed as neatly as ever, gloves on, coat brushed clean, as if polish alone could keep a man from looking smaller after being forced to hear the truth aloud. Clyde Mercer stood 2 paces behind him, suddenly interested in a loose board near his boot. A few townspeople had gathered without meaning to gather. That was how public judgment often happened out west. No one announced it. People simply stopped walking and stayed where they were. Gideon looked at the paper in Naya's hand, then at Elias. "You have made this inconvenient," he said. Elias gave him a calm, almost tired glance. "That depends on what sort of life a man is trying to keep convenient." A flicker passed over Gideon's face. Not anger exactly. Anger would have required him to stand openly in what he was. This was thinner than that. Irritation, maybe, at finding that the people he had counted on to look away had started looking directly at him instead. Naya stepped forward before Elias could answer again. The winter light caught her face, her braid, the ring at her wrist, and for the first time since he had met her, Elias saw her not as someone in flight, not as someone bracing for the next blow from the world, but as a woman fully standing in her own name. "You built your claim on silence," she said. "My mother's silence after grief. My silence after fear. The town's silence because papers looked official and your coat looked expensive. That is over now." Gideon opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. There are moments when a man realizes that words, once his strongest tools, no longer work because the room has stopped lending them weight. This was one of those moments. Mrs. Henderson, who had once watched Naya in the mercantile with the careful suspicion reserved for outsiders, looked from Gideon to the sheriff and then back to Naya with something like discomfort in her eyes. Mr. Henderson himself adjusted his spectacles and said into the general silence, "Well, a wrong is a wrong." It was not a grand act of courage. It was late and clumsy and smaller than it should have been. But in towns like Redemption, even late decency can crack a wall that has stood too long. One by one, other faces shifted. Not all. Some people never give up prejudice because truth asks too much from them. But enough. Enough to change the air. Gideon saw it happen and took one careful step backward, like a gambler realizing the table no longer favored his hand. "This territory is changing," he said, gathering what remained of his composure around him. "You would all do well to remember that." Elias's voice stayed level. "Maybe it already has." Gideon turned then, not quickly, not dramatically, and walked to his horse while the town watched the kind of departure no man ever plans for himself. He was not ruined in a single afternoon. Men like him rarely are. But something more important than money had slipped out from under him on that street. The easy obedience of others. The right to define the story before anyone else could speak. When he rode away, no one called after him. No one needed to. The silence behind him was answer enough. Later, when the street had emptied and the day thinned toward evening, Elias and Naya rode back toward the ranch with the kind of tiredness that comes after a hard road finally admits where it has been leading. Snow showed in narrow bands along the shadowed fence lines. The sky over the western hills had gone pale gold, then silver. At the turn above the creek, Elias slowed his horse and looked out over the land as if seeing it slightly changed, though the cottonwoods, the pasture, the sagging porch, and the small barn were all right where they had been. Naya drew up beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. The wind moved lightly through the dry grass. Somewhere near the lower field, a horse nickered from the corral. It was enough. It was more than enough. At last Elias reached into his coat and drew out the folded blanket pin he had picked up in town that afternoon. Plain silver, nothing fancy, just sturdy enough to hold a shawl closed against the weather. He held it out to her without flourish. "For the road," he said. Though they both knew the road he meant was no longer only the one beneath the horses. Naya looked at the pin, then at him. "I am not leaving tonight." Elias's hand stilled. "No." She shook her head once. "Not because I owe you. Not because I have nowhere else. Because when the world tried to turn me into something smaller than myself, you did not ask me to be grateful for kindness. You simply made room for it. The last light of day rested softly along the edge of her face. Elias had no practiced answer for words like that. Men who live alone too long seldom do. So he said the truest thing he had. "There is room." Naya took the pin from his hand. Her fingers touched his for one brief, quiet second, and this time neither of them treated the moment like something fragile enough to deny. They rode the final half-mile side by side. The ranch house ahead with smoke rising thin and straight from the chimney. The porch boards dim in the evening. The valley wide around them and no longer empty in quite the same way. Behind them lay a mission ledger, a street full of witnesses, and a man who had finally discovered that respect could not be bought in the same place fear was sold. Ahead of them waited chores, winter, fences to mend, coffee to make before dawn, and all the plain hard things that build a life more honestly than grand promises ever can. When they reached the yard, Elias dismounted first, then turned and offered his hand not as a rescue, not as a claim, but as a choice. Naya looked at it, then placed her hand in his, and stepped down into the cold evening light. Somewhere in the cottonwoods the wind moved again, low and steady, no longer sounding lonely at all.